Thank you. Rory Carroll is a native of Dublin, and he started his career as a journalist with the Irish News, a daily newspaper in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He moved to London, later joined The Guardian, first as a London-based reporter, then based throughout the world in Rome, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, South Africa, and Baghdad. In 2006, he moved to Venezuela to cover Latin America, where he stayed on that beat for 6 years. He was a regular visitor to Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, Cuba, and Central America as well. Caracas was his home and his focus. And I must admit, I was quite taken in reading your book that you had the choice, apparently, of where to be the first Latin American correspondent for The Guardian. You chose Caracas. I thought that was excellent.
Well, I think when I suggested Rio, they thought I was saying, taking the mickey.
There we go.
So Caracas is number 2.
Good things can't last, however, and in just a year ago, in April 2012, Rory was posted by The Guardian to Los Angeles as the West Coast bureau chief, and he currently has an eclectic beat covering general news, politics, and culture. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about the future of Venezuela, please welcome Rory Carroll.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to thank the World Affairs Council for the invitation. I'm flattered and honored to be here. Thank you, Terry, for moderating. And thank you all for turning up and listening to me talk about Venezuela. As Terry said, I'll be talking a bit about the future of Venezuela, but rather than gaze into my crystal ball, I'd feel more comfortable talking about its recent past and use that as a guide to what may or may not happen in the future. So I think also I have an additional reason to thank the World Affairs Council because I stood you guys up in March when I was due to be here, and at the last minute I had to cancel because The Guardian dispatched me to Caracas to cover Hugo Chávez's funeral, which is a pretty good reason not to come. But again, my apologies for that, and I'm glad to make up for that now. So Hugo Chávez's legacy and where does that leave us and Latin America and the United States? I mean, those are big questions for policymakers at the moment. And I think for me, the key thing to understanding where Venezuela is today is one of the central contradictions of Hugo Chávez, in that here we had a man who was a brilliant politician, absolutely extraordinarily gifted, and yet he was a disastrous manager. As a ruler, he just lacked basic competence. Now that contradiction we see written all across Venezuela today. And what we're left with now is Nicolas Maduro, his successor, in his early days is showing to not be a brilliant politician, and yet he's dealing with the legacy of Hugo Chávez's policies. So I'd like to discuss or talk about how we got here. Firstly, for me, covering Venezuela, one of the reasons I had to, in the end, write a book about it was that people from outside Venezuela would be obsessed about the question, was Hugo Chávez a dictator? Was he a tyrant? Or was he a champion of democracy and he reinvented the democratic wheel? And for me, he was a hybrid. He was an elected autocrat. He won continuous elections, but he rigged the rules a bit. He didn't rig the votes, but he rigged the rules so that they favored him to win elections. And yet this debate over was he dictator or not kind of overshadowed the more prosaic issue of just basic competence in Venezuela, like what was happening inside the country in terms of just management. And often people outside Venezuela just didn't really pay attention to that because they wanted to hear the Sturm und Drang of was there blood on the streets. And if you start talking about petroleum policy or currency controls, people's eyes would glaze over and go, they want to hear tales of the revolution or gospels of faith. And yet, really, the reality and understanding Venezuela was written in these more prosaic things of competence or lack of. And And Chavez, I mean, his background really hadn't equipped him very well to be a president, because he came from a military background. He was used to a hierarchy, and he was used to being a comandante, being obeyed and having instructions carried out. And the idea of actually ruling a government and managing this, vast, sprawling bureaucracy and getting things done through that was alien to him. And as a consequence, Venezuela's bureaucracy just sprouted and became out of control. He inherited, I think, about 11 ministries, and they blossomed a bit like the Amazon. It became 11, became 15, became 20, became 27, became 32, to the point that you would ask a minister, or you could even ask Chavez himself, how many ministries are there in Venezuela? And people go, no sé, buena pregunta, I'm not sure. And people genuinely didn't know, because they lose track. And that was symptomatic of a kind of a loss of administrative control in many ways, where there was this kind of permanent revolution in governance, and they just lost track of it. And you could see the way that, for example, the neglect of infrastructure, of just basic investment in maintenance of the power grid, resulted in, after 14 years, we see that there are power cuts weekly. And the great industries of Ciudad Guayana, if you go and visit them now, these big factories are husks. They're like ghost factories, because they literally, in many cases, the plug has been pulled on them because there's not enough power, and they want to funnel the power that there is to the cities to protect the electoral base of what is left of Chavismo. And the same with agriculture. They invested or spent billions of dollars in trying to reinvent agriculture, and it was unfortunately just misspent. It just disappeared in a miasma of lack of control, of all these agricultural agencies that would be set up, and then they would disappear. There was also corruption, and a result of which, after this great big, as Chavez would put it, effort to create food sovereignty, Venezuela is importing more food than ever before, so much so that hundreds of thousands of tons of food rotted at the ports because they couldn't import it fast enough. And now today we see shortages again in Venezuela of basic goods, coffee, sugar, flour, so that when these goods do arrive in supermarkets, you see these scenes that could almost be out of Havana, in terms of just people like get so excited, my God, there's sugar, and people will tweet about it. And that's not to say that there's starvation or hunger in Venezuela. Far from it. People are actually eating more than before, but there's this moneyed dysfunction that has kind of hollowed out the economy. And in infrastructure, what was really quite shocking, just to give you two examples of just how bad it got as the years accumulated, were that when there were summits in Venezuela, and Chavez loved having summits. There's always, every couple of months it seemed, there was foreign leaders being brought in, and they would basically tart up Caracas to impress foreign dignitaries. So they would paint the roadways, these yellow lines along the roadways to try to mask the fact that basically the motorways were crumbling. They would paint the houses lining the motorway bright colors, so they could look to try to, again, disguise a bit of the fact that these barrios, the slums, were just growing and becoming increasingly crumbling in many ways. And I remember one day I saw them prior to a particularly big summit. I think it was the Russians were coming. These workmen painted the rubble. They painted the rubble yellow by the side of the road. And, rather than clear the rubble or figure out why is the rubble here, no, it's just paint it, and that looks okay, and let's hope for the best. And that was symptomatic of a wider trend. To the extent of, I used to go to the palace, Miraflores Palace in central Caracas for press conferences, and Chavez would be there, and very charming as ever, and very loquacious as ever, and he would come out and he would welcome the journalists, and he would launch into a spiel, and you never knew how long it was going to last. 4 hours was cutting it short. Often it would be more like 7 or 8 hours. But he would extol the triumphs of the revolution, of these shiny new projects, of this kind of gleaming new promise of things that were happening, and yet his words were betrayed by his own palace. If you look up over him, there would be, especially you would have these press conferences sometimes on the terrace, you could see that the roof over him was missing tiles. The paintwork on the palace was often flaking. It would be painted every year, but the paintwork was so shoddy that it would flake within months. There would be a vague odor of urine in the gardens. Now, this is the presidential palace. And a minister confided that in Chavez's private elevator, and he lived in the palace, it was his residence, this was kind of the White House, in his private elevator, when it rained, the rain would leak into the president's elevator. And Chavez himself apparently would, just roll his eyes with the minister and his, basically in frustration and shame that it was like this, because Venezuela was enjoying a historic oil boom, unprecedented. It had more money than it knew what to do with for a time. And yet, unfortunately, there was this level of dysfunction, which applied to lots of other things too, like the currency. The bolivar lost about 90% of its value over the past 14 years. That's on a par, I think, with Uzbekistan and Congo. And yet Chavez, in this kind of Orwellian way, he renamed the bolivar fuerte, the strong bolivar, as his policies systematically weakened it. And I could go on, in terms of the levels of dysfunction. And yet the genius of the man was that he was able to build and win election after election after election. Now, the elections weren't especially fair. As I mentioned earlier, he did rig the rules. He could disqualify a certain opposition candidate if the guy was too charismatic or too good looking. But they were relatively fair. People could vote against him if they wanted to. And he won election after election. And largely that was just due to the fact that the guy was politically very, very shrewd. Now, on the international stage, often there would appear to be a kind of a clowning image. He would play the buffoon at times. But that really masked a very acute political intelligence. And, of course, he was blessed with the fact that Venezuela had this historic oil boom, and he had about $1 trillion. And for Venezuela and for the population, that's huge amount of money. And he spent it in a way that certainly helped alleviate poverty. There were very impressive falls in poverty from 2003 until about 2009. And he spent a lot of it in an enlightened way on social programs, clinics, subsidized grocery stores, and there was good stuff, and people were very happy and grateful for that. But it was spent in a way, and this became increasingly clear, in a way that just wasn't sustainable or was in a way demagogic, that people, to get certain benefits, you would have to vote for Chavez. And so even though the dysfunction was getting worse, people would continue to vote for him. And one of the key reasons for this was just the guy was so charismatic. He was a communicator of genius. He could play with the language, with Spanish. In a way, he would invent words, invent expressions. He had a wonderful memory, whereby he could recall poems and songs and legends from his youth, and he would sprinkle his discourse with boyhood anecdotes, with references to baseball games, and then he'd go back to, say, referring to Antonio Gramsci and a bit of ideology. He would then flirt with someone in the audience, or he would toy with a Western journalist like myself one time when I asked him a question which he didn't like, and he proceeded to use me as a rhetorical rag doll for 30 minutes, and he just and used me as a fall guy, but in a very clever way that made for great television. And what really was the bedrock of his rule, of his popularity, was that poor Venezuelans just felt, this guy is on our side. The president is one of us. He really is looking out for me. And that even if inflation is burning through my wage packet, even if crime is out of control and murder rates have tripled, well, maybe it's the fault of the police chief, or there's a useless justice minister. But Chavez, mi comandante, he's on my side. And that was an incredibly powerful feeling to engender in people. And any other politician could only envy him, his capacity to do that. And that was one of the reasons he was able to continue winning elections. Now, the magic was beginning to fade by 2012. In his final election in October, you could see that the economy was basically had sprouted so many holes that even with oil prices high, there still wasn't enough money to sustain what he needed, which was like this endless river of petrodollars flushing through the economy. So they had to start borrowing billions from China to try to plug the gaps. And they created or confected an artificial boom, much in its own way that Chavez stimulated his own body, because the man was dying. He was in the final stages of terminal cancer, and in a kind of rather macabre way, the way he tried to mimic. What he was doing to the economy, which is basically injecting this artificial life into it. Doctors were doing the same with his own body. They were giving him lots of steroids and painkillers to help him through an incredibly arduous election campaign, and to mask the fact that his own physical decay from the Venezuelan people. And he did it very successfully. And personally, I think there's a lot of pathos in that. I mean, he felt, I think, that he was sacrificing his life for the revolution, because he probably accelerated his own death by campaigning so hard instead of actually resting, which is what he should have done. But in any case, when he did die, he left this legacy of a very strong and enduring cult of personality, which, much as Peronism in Argentina endures to this day, I think Chavismo, or at least the name Chavismo, will endure for decades to come. And yet the country is increasingly, it's a basket case, socially and economically. And what we now have in Nicolas Maduro is a politician who appears to lack Chavez's political talents. He certainly is not charismatic, and he certainly seems to lack Chavez's strategic sense of how to gain tactical advantage and to turn setbacks into something that will somehow fortify his power. And I think for me the concern now is that Chavez, through his political talents and his charisma and his popularity, were able to give him this cushion, which meant that he never really had to become a dictator. He never, there was repression under Chavez, but it was always sporadic, selective, and light. And we're not talking about death squads. We're talking about intimidation, a few people being jailed. Depending who you talk to, it's dozens, usually on charges of corruption. So, but could be de facto political prisoners. But it was light repression, and it wasn't the key to his rule or the key to his longevity. Whereas in the case now of Nicolas Maduro, he lacks Chavez's authority. He lacks the same degree of legitimacy. And he lacks his charisma, and therefore I think that's why we are seeing him now relying more on the jackboot than Chavez ever had to do. For example, certainly in the last couple of weeks, well, maybe we can talk about this when I take questions. We've seen kind of a nastier side to the government, and it's showing more teeth than Chavez did. And that, to me, is a worrying sign, because it's very early days of Chavez's new government, and it just makes me very concerned for what is to come. So thank you very much, and I'll be open to questions.
Thank you, and as a reminder, we're talking with Rory Carroll, the West Coast correspondent for The Guardian, who is just off a 6-year stint in Caracas, Venezuela, covering Latin America. One of the things that struck me about your book, Comandante, Hugo Chávez's Venezuela, was the role played by identity. I don't think I've read a book about recent history that has so many people that you were unable to actually name. Often you gave them a pseudonym, and you said that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true, especially for those who are... To write the book, I was fascinated by the palace and the ecosystem around Miraflores and Hugo Chávez. He was the Sun King, and how the people revolved around him. Now, it was very easy to speak to and get their people to go on their record if they had since fallen out with Chavez. For example, I interviewed Raúl Baduel, who was once his brother-in-arms, his defense minister, who then fell out with Chavez and ended up in jail. And I interviewed Baduel in his jail cell a couple of times, and it was, of course, able to name him. But for those Chavistas who are still inside the system, be it at senior level, ministerial level, or lower down the food chain, they usually spoke to me on condition of anonymity. I mean, one example, I called her Sarah in the book. She was a mid-ranking civil servant. She was in the penal service. And I used to meet her after she finished work, and she would come out from her office, and I could barely get a word in because she had so much to say. She would just kind of explode, this kind of river of words, because she was so frustrated and ashamed with what was happening and her role in this, because Venezuela's prisons, which were very grim to begin with before Chavez, went from grim to horrific in terms of the murder rate. Within prisons, about 500 prisoners die every year just in Venezuela's prisons. They are ruled by the inmates. And these massacres happen with horrible frequency. And per capita, I mean, the murder rate or there is far, far worse than anything you would see in Brazil or Mexico, which also have grim prisons. Now, Sarah I remember one time, she gave me one anecdote that she said the latest trick was for gangs inside prisons to strangle their victims rather than to stab them or shoot them, because this way the deaths could be recorded as suicide. And this would facilitate do a favor to the warden, because that way the murder rate could be kept down. And Sarah was so upset. I mean, she thought this is just wrong. And she said also, another little detail, that she said they'd gone through like penal directors every year. That, again, part of this dysfunction of Chavez was just, there's no malice. I mean, Chavez didn't want the prisons to become horrible, but he just, his system of government didn't lend itself to good governance. So every year there'll be a new director of prisons. And Sarah told me, she said, once finally we got a good one. We got a guy who's really competent. He was trained. He was a lawyer. He knew what he was doing. He was shaking up the department. We felt we were going to make some progress and begin to really make things better in the jails. And then what happens? Chavez gets wind of the fact that this guy is really good at his job and plucks him from the penal service and appoints him the head of his Twitter account. And that was an example of the priorities. And so, needless to say, Sarah, who's still there, I mean, she's still working. We could only speak on condition of anonymity because otherwise she would lose her job.
When I was struck with the number of anonymous people you spoke with, including the young woman who you mentioned should probably have been sort of going to bars and thinking about boys, but she was actually in charge of La Lista in her town or her province, and the fact of, you can understand why people were hiding their identities, if you'll explain to people what La Lista was.
Yes, La Lista Tason was basically a revenge list. After Chavez won, there was a referendum to try to oust him in 2004. Now, he won that referendum, but he then took vengeance against those who had voted against him, who had signed a petition to remove him, because in the petition their names, addresses were all listed, and an assembly at Chavista put all these on the internet. And this list was then methodically used by the state at all levels of provincial, federal, regional level to oust people from their jobs. People who had voted against Chavez, if you had any form of, if you were a civil servant, you were fired. If you had some petition pending, you're looking for a housing grant or whatever, then you'll be struck off the list. And this, of course, struck fear into a lot of people. And this list is used to this day, by the way. I mean, almost a decade later, it's still used. Now, this girl I met, I say girl, she was in her early 20s. She was just fresh out of college. She had specialized in IT. She was living in Mérida, a lovely, pretty Andean town. And her first job was in the mayor's office. And she said that she's so excited and she's so proud to have got a job in the mayor's office, because it was a difficult thing to get, great benefits, and her family was proud. But then she discovered that her job in the mayor's office was to apply La Lista, that she would go through using her IT skills to to double check the database of the list with people who either were lined up to receive certain grants or benefits, and just to make sure that they weren't getting them if they were on the list. And some of her friends, or the parents of her friends, were on this list. And so she'd go into work and sit at her desk every day and do something that she knew to be immoral, knew to be wrong. And the poor thing, I mean, I felt sorry for her because, I mean, no 22, 23-year-old should be put in that position. And she kind of wrestled with her conscience, and, well, she lost because she stayed doing that with the hope that she would be able to move to another job within the state sector. And because in Venezuela, having a job within the state sector is very valuable, because the more the private sector has become shriveled, the more attractive it is to work within the state sector. And given that there's a doubt over there's a perception that maybe when you vote, that the vote is not secret. This has never been proven, but there's a perception that this is the case. If you work and have a government job, you really you want to secure your government job by voting for the government, and this certainly applied to her. And to me, that was tragic for her. And I think, I remember she finally confessed to me, that her job was La Lista, and I mean there were almost tears in her eyes.
Yeah. Well, we've heard a lot of about the dysfunctionality and the less than transparent democratic traditions that seem to have been increased in the last decade. There must have been something positive. I mean, there were some numbers like 35 to 40% of the population who continued to vote for him, with about 35% voting against. And you note that the other were called the ni-nis, neither nors. Mm-hmm. In terms of this decade, is there anything that you would put up as a positive aspect?
Oh, for sure. The fact that poverty fell so steeply was impressive, and obviously to be welcomed. I mean, I have to give a caveat, though, that when oil prices spiked so high and spending was so high, it was almost inevitable that poverty would fall. But, it was under Chavez's watch, and all credit to him. But I think a more enduring virtue will be the fact that poverty and the alleviation of poverty is now central to political discourse in Venezuela. Before Chavez, it was often the political elites were able, in many ways, just to ignore the poor. I mean, they would give them subsidies and other benefits, but really there was never quite the same attention to the poor, certainly not the same rhetorical attention. Because the elites had this self-contained echo chamber of media people and politicians and business people who would go to Miami for their shopping trips, and they could basically afford to ignore the slums up in the hills. And they could go to Miami, and the famous catch cry of Venezuelans in those days was "Tan barato, dame dos." So cheap, give me two, of whatever it was, And now that still happens, although increasingly it might be the new Chavista class called the boligarchs who may be doing that. But at least any government in Venezuela is now compelled, after Chavez, to A, acknowledge that poverty is the single biggest problem and priority in the country, and B, to do something or seem to be doing something about it. And that is to his eternal credit.
I think that's a very good point. I'd like to switch for a second and talk about his impact on the rest of his neighbors, the rest of Latin America. We know that there were close ties with Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, those in particular. I'm not sure if there are other places that you would say beyond those. Is this part of the question of where the money went? Did a lot of the actual resources of the government end up going to support these relationships? And were they successful?
A lot of the money went to Cuba, which to this day receives about 90 to 100,000 barrels of discounted oil, which has been an incredibly important lifeline for the Cuban... Each day.
Each day.
Which is an incredible lifeline for the Cuban economy. And Chavez's largesse for Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Ecuador was not as generous. But he did give subsidize political projects there. But I think what's instructive is how, in some ways, the pupils outgrew the master, because rhetorically, Bolivia, Evo Morales and Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua all echo Chavez in terms of his rhetoric, and they would always stand shoulder to shoulder with him. But they were smart enough not to emulate his economic model. A, because they didn't have as much oil as Chavez, is probably the main reason. But B, I think, is because they knew that way lay ruin. So they had to be a bit more pragmatic than Chavez. Mm-hmm. And that was the way that Venezuela forfeited a chance of global leadership, or regional leadership, because there was this debate maybe 7 years ago, well, who's going to be the leader in Latin America? Will it be Hugo Chávez or will it be Lula in Brazil? And the gradual the decaying and flaking of Venezuela's model meant that, by the time Chavez died, there was no question the leader was Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Well, you make a good point. Lula actually, you can demonstrate through the HD, the Human Development Index numbers, that did a lot more, I think. Although I need to look up Venezuela's to see what the actual improvement was. There was another case that was interesting, I thought, I think it was 2 years ago, when it looked as though a socialist, or not, if not socialist, certainly leftist candidate in Peru might be winning the election. And then the turnaround came because of the fact that Hugo Chávez was starting to weigh in on his side, I understand.
Yes, it appeared to backfire when Ollanta Humala was leading, and Chavez, said, vote for him, and Peruvians reacted badly to this, just as appeared to have happened in Mexico in 2006, when López Obrador narrowly lost the election. And some people partly attribute that to Chavez intervening and urging Mexicans to vote for a particular candidate, and people just bristled at that. And polls showed, actually all the way through Chavez's rule, that Chavez wasn't really popular in Latin America. Often in the Latino Barometer poll, he was almost on a ranking with George Bush. It was very striking. And in Chavez's defense, I would say that often that could be because Latin American media often is owned by a small, rich elite, which obviously could never happen in the United States. And so the reporting of Chavez across Latin America tended to be very, very hostile. And so you could argue that his unpopularity in the region was merely reflecting the fact that people were receiving very biased reports about him. But the fact is, he actually wasn't very, very popular. But just as a little segue, in Peru, eventually this guy, Humala, did win a subsequent election. He's now the president of Peru, and he would have been considered the brother the de facto brother of Hugo Chavez, and sort of a version of Chavez in Peru. But in reality, it's much more moderate. And now Nicolas Maduro recently recalled Venezuela's ambassador, who was in Peru, and this should be his kind of brother state, if you like, just because Peru's government had the temerity to call for dialogue and reconciliation in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And so Maduro just reacted so cack-handedly to that. Again, it's just a sign that he's not Hugo Chavez, really, that he is, frankly, it looks like he's floundering.
Mm-hmm. Another institution that we've talked a little bit about, but not in depth, is the military in Venezuela. We note that, of course, Hugo Chavez was a lieutenant colonel, I believe, when he did his first attempt at politics by a failed coup. Mm-hmm. And the military, in some respects, was apparently responsible for reversing the coup that almost took him down.
Yes.
Talk about where the military is today and what the relationship is with Maduro, if you would.
Well, just firstly on Chavez and the military. The military was smart enough when Chavez signed up. He was a young boy from the plains. He joined the military because he wanted to play baseball. He was a very talented pitcher, and his dream was to play in the big leagues. And he felt that the military would be a great avenue to that. But once he joined the military, he fell in love with it. He's a fish in water. He just loved the uniforms, the marching, the camaraderie. And the military recognized his talents as a talker, and they made communications one of his specialities. So they had him. He was comparing beauty pageants, which even in the military there was pageants, and also tanks or heavy armor were his two specialties: communications and tanks. And you could argue that later in his political career, I mean, he reflected both of those that training, because he was often described as a paratrooper, and he did jump out of planes a couple of times, but he never liked it. He much preferred being on the ground in a tank and on the radio talking. I mean, that was his forte. And he exploded literally into Venezuela's consciousness in 1992 by staging a coup against a very unpopular but democratically elected government. The coup was a military fiasco, but in surrendering, Chavez went on television, and with his gift of the gab, he electrified people. He'd only had about 2 or 3 minutes, and that was enough to electrify people's attention. And so he was able to launch a political career. And when he took power, though, he was very conscious of Venezuela's history, that the military were always dangerous to any Venezuelan president. They would often overthrow or kill, exile a president. And in fact, they were crucial to a coup against Chavez in 2002. And then when the coup ringleaders basically blundered, the military or certain generals changed their mind, and they said, bring him back. And so they saved him then. And Chavez was very clever afterwards in dividing and ruling. He deliberately, to neutralize any threat from the military, he jumbled up, for instance, the system of promotions. So people never quite knew if you're a lieutenant how to become a captain, and the generals were in such a way that all the officers were always so busy trying to hopscotch over each other to get ahead, that they were too busy doing that than plotting against Hugo Chavez. But to bring us up to date, now the military could potentially play a crucial role in Venezuela. They are certainly the strongest institution in Venezuela, arguably the only really functioning institution. The military, however, is very, very politicized, which is against the constitution, but Chavez made it his business to politicize the army, and he made them, now if you're in the military, you need to pledge allegiance to socialism. And this was one of the reasons that Nicolas Maduro, or Raúl Baduel, his former defense minister, opposed him and ended up in jail. But now everyone is looking to the military to see what are they going to do, because it's divided into factions. Some of the top brass are opportunistic and frankly kleptocratic, and they line their pockets. Either they're on the border with Colombia, controlling the border, and means they can control the gasoline smuggling, or they can go down to the state of Amazonas and control diamond smuggling, or they can run any number of businesses and make lots of money. And that's how Chavez bought the quiescence of some of his senior military guys. Now Maduro, I think would like to do that as well, and I'm sure I imagine he is. But the danger for him is that beneath the top brass, you have more mid-ranking, maybe captains, majors, who aren't getting rich, and they see their superiors becoming millionaires, and they unless they're getting a piece of the pie, they can feel indignant. They can feel this is immoral, and also they can just think, well, and I'm not getting any, and so that's a dangerous position. And so I've heard even some opposition people in the past few weeks saying, why can't we appeal to the military now to try and resolve this political crisis, which I think could be very dangerous, because the last thing Venezuela really should have is another coup or another military intervention, because that it's a big temptation, but therein lies a whole world of trouble.
Thank you. That's a good summary of the military's role. I note that there are several questions which are asking about current politics, including such things as why Enrique Capriles, who ran against Chavez, decided not to. He decided not to accept, but has accepted. It's a little unclear to me what's going on there. And another question I really liked was, is there anything that an opposition can do to actually get back in and start garnering votes, given the changes in the democratic, the structure of the institutions, which seem to favor the Chavistas?
Well, for that first question about Enrique Capriles, who is the opposition leader, young governor, I think he's only 40 or 41 years old. And yes, what he has done, the strategy so far has been since the election in March, the opposition has cried foul. They say that, this vote was not clean. We want either a recount or a new vote. And of course, the government is not agreeing to that. So what they've done is they've gone through to the institutions of Venezuela's state, the electoral watchdog and the courts, even though these are themselves politicized, to say these are we don't accept these results. So to try to register the illegitimacy of the government as the opposition sees it. But what the opposition is not doing is mobilizing people for big protests. They're not calling for a general strike. They're not calling people out onto the streets for what Venezuelans call guarimbas. They're not setting up kind of burning tires. They're not shutting down motorways. Tactics which they tried before, back in 2002 and other times. And Capriles is not doing that. And I think that's shrewd, and I think it's merciful, because if he did, bloodshed would ensue. So I think now there's a debate within the opposition. Do the radicals want to do that, and they're pushing for that, whereas I think cooler heads for now appear to be prevailing and saying, well, no, we can't, because that'll just blow up on our faces, perhaps even literally. We don't know, but it's a very fluid situation. So, I mean, this could change. And for your other question was about, what was, remind me?
Having more to do with what the opposition could do, not what they're doing, but in terms to fight against the system where it's rigged against them right now in some respects.
Yeah, there's an interesting debate within the opposition, which is, well, how do we engage with the state? If we are saying to our voters and the world that the Venezuelan state has been co-opted entirely by a tyrant, and that the courts are illegitimate, and a central bank, and how then can we go through and try to protest through these institutions? So it's tough for them. What do they do? And also, meantime, the media, they've been crowded out of media space, because the state media apparatus is now huge, and it controls or mediates the message in Venezuela. And there's only one openly opposition television station left called Globovisión, and that appears now to be slowly being silenced. At least it's now has been bought by someone with links to the government. So for the opposition, it's very, very difficult to get their message out. How do they communicate with voters? And that said, which is one of the reasons why some strategists are saying, well, you know what, let's just take a step back and give the government space to hang itself, because economically, if tough times are coming for Venezuela, because Maduro faces at least two big problems. One is the economy is increasingly curdling, because this artificial boom that Chavez created is ending. The debt levels have soared. There's so many holes leaking in the economy that it's difficult for the government to keep the sense that things are getting better, because inflation is eroding people's wage packets. The bolivar has been devalued twice in recent months, and so people. So there's a sense that, and the economic conditions are going to get worse and worse and worse. And at the same time, Maduro is facing internal challenges within Chavismo, because it's a very factionalist movement. So he will struggle to assert his authority there. So from an opposition's point of view, it could make sense, or you could make the case, well, let's retreat a bit. Let's take a step back, wait for the economy to get worse, and let Maduro kind of struggle with his own opposition, or with his own internal opposition, and we will just have to bide our time. But the risk to that strategy is that they will then just become irrelevant, because if you turn on a Venezuelan radio station, or you channel surf, you hardly see the opposition voices. You hardly hear them or see them, and so they could just become this kind of shadowy kind of group, and so they would lose the initiative. Mm-hmm. So I think for the moment it's an unanswerable conundrum for the opposition.
So again, in terms of metrics, am I right that before Chavez started taking over the media, Government channel was like one channel out of 10, and very not watched very much, something like that.
That's right. There was, I think, just one state channel when Chavez took over, and now I think there's about 5. There are still private channels, big ones, who are much more popular than the government channels. But those remaining private channels have reached an accord or a pact with the government, which is they basically neutralize their political coverage. They're allowed to do game shows, beauty pageants, soap operas, and their news reports basically are either very, very late at night and thin stuff. They don't really report much about politics, and they just don't engage. So that in terms of actual news reporting, you're left with these state channels. And they're increasingly kind of surreal or Orwellian in their use of projection of personality cult. It's all about Chavez as Christ the Redeemer. When Maduro said in the election campaign that Chavez came and visited him in the form of a little blue bird, and he actually mimicked the bird chirping, which I can't do, alas, but and that Chavez spoke to him and so on. The government channels will report this in a very kind of po-faced manner and very deferential. This is as if this is a normal thing, and so so now basically these government channels dominate the agenda, and again that's muffling the opposition voice, and so that's why they're struggling to remain relevant.
Yeah. As a parenthesis, I was interested in learning in your book that early on, one of Chavez's favorite books was by an author I must admit I'd not heard of, Plekhanov's The Role of the Individual in History. Do you think he learned about, what did he learn from that? Because you note that as being something important to him.
Yeah, Chavez was a great reader and a real bookworm. Something like to give that impression, and he would often refer to Plekhanov and basically the role of the great man in history, of a man of destiny or providence who somehow was chosen, and that an individual actually could make a difference, and that an individual could be the spark which could then ignite a movement. And Chavez often referred to this. Which in a way undermined his own, kind of quasi-Marxist belief. So there was a real mush and lots of contradictions in his ideology, which forever remained vague and was never especially, it was never consistent. And that was part of the mystery of Chavez. Well, what does he actually think? But also in his reading, a lot of people I spoke to who knew him really well, they said, you know what, the guy doesn't actually read books that much. He said that what he does is he'll read a few pages of a book, and he's such a wonderful, basically almost like a visual memory or photographic memory, plus a gift of the gab, that he can make it look like he's read the whole book, and he can just wing it. And so he can, and most students would give their left arm to have that capacity, or I think, and any of us in any meeting would do so. And he had a great talent. And I spoke to one of his, in the book there's a chapter where I meet his reader, this wonderful old kind of historian who had this kind of team of academics who were this kind of like, and they would basically read books for Chavez, and then they would put them notes on this size in these cards, and they would feed this to the palace. And so even sometimes during, Chavez would be on TV, he was on TV almost every day, and he'd be giving one of his long talks. And if at some point during a talk he struggled to remember a certain date or some detail, someone in the palace would phone one of these historians and say, what, can you check that, find out what that is? Because some of this stuff was so arcane that, Google couldn't answer the question. So, these historians would, go out to their archives and these kind of dusty folders and go into their basements and find out that, the name of a battle or some date, was it raining in 1817 when there was this battle, and they would phone the palace and say, give the answer, and this would then be fed to Chavez and slipped to note, maybe 2 hours later when he's still talking, and then he'd refer back to it. Remember, I was wondering, was it raining that particular day? Well, yes, I remember it was raining, and and that was part of the choreography of the president, and so and also books, like he kept encouraging Venezuelans to read, because the Venezuelans are not big readers, unlike, say, Mexicans or Argentinians. In Venezuela, book readership tends to be rather low, and he used to badger his people, say, you must read. And yet, unfortunately, one of the effects of this economic dysfunction was it became very expensive for people to import books, for these booksellers to do so. So it's not that there was censorship, but it's just they couldn't import them because the exchange rate wouldn't be favorable enough. And so the bookshops, at least privately owned bookshops, became increasingly threadbare and sad places, which is yet again one of the other contradictions, like a bookworm president, and yet increasingly thin shelves.
That's great. I'd like to turn back again to the role of women in the Chavez administration. And you mentioned Sarah, the young woman in the prison system. You talked about the woman who had to do La Lista. There are three other women in your book that stood out for me. One was his first wife. The second was the American's quasi-journalist Eva Collinger. And the third was Maria Lourdes Afiuni, who was a judge. All three had a lot of FaceTime, apparently, with this charismatic person, and had three different outcomes.
Yes, they. His wife, he was married twice. The first wife he divorced in the 1990s after his coup, and we never really heard from her again. She remained a private figure. His second wife, however, Marie Isabel, was a striking figure. She was very, very kind of pale-skinned and blonde and blue-eyed, and she really helped him to win power in his first election in 1998. Because a lot of Venezuelans at that time were nervous of this guy. He's recently just out of jail for his attempted coup. He had a whiff of cordite about him, and some people were nervous. And so he had this wife whom I'm not sure how much detail. Well, he met her, and as he himself alluded to, he impregnated her on the first date in a car. And we know this because he told the nation on a broadcast once that it was him and her and chatting, and this was part of the presidential shtick. Was he's referring to, do you remember that date, Marie Isabel, when we first met, and whoops, there was an accident, and she got pregnant, and so then they got married.
Even the brand of the van, right?
Yes, I think it was. The brand escapes me, but that was noted for posterity, and. So she helped him, and she became a public figure and became very popular for the first few years of his rule. But then it became very much a torrid relationship. She became very jealous of him, and there's different versions of what exactly went wrong in the marriage. But by 2004, I think the marriage was over, and they subsequently divorced, and then had a very public falling out, and it got unfortunately very ugly. But then she disappeared really from view, and he became an official bachelor, which meant that he became kind of wedded to the revolution, and at which point an official veil was draped over his private life. Like, well, this guy is, he would allude, he would flirt with women in audiences, but who's Chavez dating? And there's all these stories and endless rumors, like he's dating the soap opera star, or then Naomi Campbell came to visit him in Caracas, and there was a whole lot of speculation about that because they were clearly flirting on camera, and so on. But in Venezuela, the press respected his privacy, and I think rightly so. And so his romantic life became just a source of endless speculation. The second woman is Eva Gollinger. Now, she is an American attorney from New York, and she went down to help Chavez in 2002 after the coup attempt against him. She dug into archives in the United States and revealed...
using the Freedom of Information Act, talking about good traditions, right?
And she came up with details about U.S. involvement or complicity or knowledge, at least, of the coup against Chavez in 2002. And this kind of opened the door to her to be part of the revolution. And she, to this day, occupies a position as... So she doesn't have an official position in the government, but she would often be brought on for official events, and she would be was the editor of a government or state-funded newspaper, and she also encouraged the government to take on to crack down on NGOs. She claimed, and her background, it was very much left-wing, liberal, progressive, kind of feminist and so forth, and yet she ended up sponsoring or encouraging Chavez to adopt a law about 3 years ago, cracking down on NGOs, saying these NGOs are infiltrating the revolution, they are a wedge for foreign powers, the United States, to create problems, and they need to be controlled. We need to kind of choke their funding before they can spread their imperialist tentacles in the country. And I mean, to me, that was an example of something gone wrong. I mean, here would be somebody having progressive views, and at the end, after being so many years in the hothouse of the revolution, supporting something, basically snuffing out or intimidation of dissent and of alternative voices. So that was a very, very striking case study. And then the third one is a judge, Maria Lourdes Afuni, and she was just a regular judge, a circuit court judge, mid-ranking, and she had the misfortune to rule on a hot potato of a case. There was a banker who had been jailed for 3 years. He still hadn't been charged, and for various reasons, Chavez really didn't like this banker. So this guy was kind of rotting in prison, and judges had successfully just kind of kept him rotting in prison. They didn't matter that no charges were being brought, and that's what judges were expected to do because the judiciary was politicized. She decided, when the case came to her, to release him. She released him on bail, said, well, you can't keep him here forever unless we charge him, so, he's now on bail. And straight away, the guy then skipped off on a motorbike and he fled the country. And she was then herself jailed. Chavez went on TV, I think the very next day, to thunder against her, say this judge has defiled the dignity of our country. She has obviously been bribed, and she needs to go to jail, and in a previous time she would be executed. And so sure enough, she's in jail, and she basically then she was left to rot in jail, and I interviewed her. One of the contradictions of Venezuela, you would think, oh, is this a weird kind of a grim dictatorship? It's actually very easy to get into the jails to interview these people, even as a journalist. And I interviewed her there, and she basically had very serious problems. She had been sexually assaulted in jail. She got cancer, and she had all these very serious health problems. And so Chavez eventually, they released her under house arrest. So to this day, she remains under house arrest, and so she can't leave her home. And she's just left kind of dangling in the wind like that. And that's, again, it became a cause célèbre. And to this day, I just think of her, and whether or not she was guilty of what Chavez said, I have no idea. But I just do know that he politicized the case to the extent that she couldn't get a fair trial.
Thank you. I've got several questions here talking or asking more questions about the murder rate and whether the army, since Chavez was from the army himself, might be used to fight crime. And also, is there any way to increase education? Could the Catholic Church weigh back in? There are lots of questions about the situation today in terms of personal safety and what can be done to improve things. And we have I have another question after that. We only have a few minutes left, so
okay.
If you address that for a little bit.
I will rattle on. Crime, you speak to any Venezuelan today and ask what's the main issue for you or concern, and almost all poor, middle class, rich will say crime. People are afraid of being kidnapped, they're afraid of being murdered, and this reflects a total breakdown, really, of the judicial system, from the police to the courts to the prisons, and this total impunity. About 97% of murders go unpunished. So it's a fantastic place to commit a murder because you're not going to get caught. And so the murder rate has tripled over the past 14 years. So Venezuela is now, and Caracas is far, far deadlier than Mexico City, and far deadlier even than Baghdad. Which is, I was thinking, does the Guardian want to kill me? I mean, first they sent me to Baghdad, then I was in Johannesburg, and then Caracas. So like they're trying to, tell me something. And it was, Chavez didn't want crime to get out of control. I mean, he was totally blindsided by that. I mean, it was not in his interests, I think, to have crime explode like that. He thought that, as many people would, that, well, poverty is falling, empowering the poor, as he saw it. Therefore, crime, you would think, would fall, but instead it exploded again because of this kind of dysfunction and administrative kind of anarchy. And how do you fix that? Well, the answer was that Chavez didn't. I mean, I could say one thing in his defense, that he didn't go lunge for the mano duro, the iron fist, which is so common in Latin America. He didn't deploy kind of death squads to go out and kill criminals, shoot them on sight. Or he didn't bring back the death penalty, for instance, which could have been quite popular. And he didn't do that. I mean, he stayed true to his, at least rhetorically, to these, progressive credentials. But they didn't really. I think they deployed the National Guard a few times, and it was a total fiasco. So they went back to their barracks, leaving the police force to try to deal with it. And the police are often the criminals. I mean, they moonlight as kidnappers and bandits a lot of the time. So it's a very grim situation. You had another situation about the church.
Whether there's any way to improve education, or whether the Catholic Church could be a factor. It's one of the questions that came through, and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, well, in some ways, education did get was certainly expanded. Chavez spent a lot of money expanding, building new schools and building new colleges, and which was great. But unfortunately, the quality control was sacrificed. They wanted kind of quantity rather than quality. And it's notable that they don't allow any metrics to be measured by any kind of international standards. But at least on the surface, there is more availability for education. So there's more kind of scholarships or programs and courses available. Now, so it's easier to get a degree or some sort of diploma. The thing is, then you're probably not going to there's no meaningful job waiting for you that can be used with this diploma. Mm-hmm. In terms of the Catholic Church, it's never been especially strong, really well, at least in the past century in Venezuela. Unlike Mexico or Argentina, Venezuelans are not. They're almost all nominally Catholic, but they're not, super Catholic. So the church could have a role to play, but it's so politicized now as well. It's seen as being part of the opposition that it would be almost impossible politically for the government now to give an opening and to try to use the church's resources to, for example, to improve education.
Yeah. A final question. Social media. What is the role going forward, and what has the role been of things like Twitter and Facebook in Venezuela? Is it large penetration?
Yeah, Venezuelans love Twitter. Well, they love talking, and Chavez loved talking. And I think per capita, Twitter is per capita is in Venezuela is one of the highest rates in Latin America. And Chavez was very good at incorporating Twitter into part of his presidential choreography. And it said that the government said that he had a 200 strong Twitter team actually helping him, and he became part of his rule. So what he would do, for example, during a very kind of solemn press conference or some event with state protocol, when he'd be flanked with ministers or visiting prime minister from somewhere, he'd suddenly kind of interrupt the proceedings and look at his BlackBerry or then his smartphone and go, hang on, sorry, everybody, I have to stop this for the moment because I've just received this tweet from, Maria, Gonzalez in Barinas, and she says that she's a mother of 4, or maybe the roof has, a storm has blown off her roof. Oh, this is terrible. Her children are getting wet, and she's asking for the help because she tweeted me, and then he'll show the tweet, and this is terrible. And then he'll say, "Where is my housing minister?" And of course, all the ministers were forever at these events, so the housing minister will stand stand up and Chavez will read out the details and say, housing minister, attend to this. The minister will take out his pen and he'll say yes. And this will all be on camera, on live television. The minister will write it down. And Chavez will say, and what else? Oh, and she also says one of the children maybe has pneumonia or something, and health minister, where the health minister jumps up and he'll take out, and this became part of Chavez's rule, and then eventually he'll then resume whatever the event was. And that was very clever because it made for good television, because otherwise this is like a boring protocol event. And it made for everyone else who was watching that think, oh my God, that could be me. I mean, if I tweet him, to ask for, I want a college grant, I want a hip replacement, I want whatever, maybe I'll get it, It's like a lottery ticket. And so he, and that was so clever. And people again felt like this is a good, this guy's electric on TV, and maybe, while he's still in power, that I've got my lottery ticket, which is, by using Twitter. And you can already see now Maduro just doesn't have that mojo, I mean, it takes a special, presence to be able to pull that off. And I can't really imagine Obama doing it either, for that matter. So, so social media now to this day, well, yeah, it remains a strong force.
Unfortunately, that concludes our program for the evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Rory Carroll for his excellent talk on this.
Thank you very much.